Hi everyone, thanks for joining us this evening. I'm Simon from Five Leaves, and I just need to do a little bit of housekeeping before we get started properly. If anybody has any questions for Jamie later on in the event, can you use the Q&A box along the bottom rather than the chat, just because they'll get lost quite easily. You can use the chat if you want, we encourage you to do so, but it just might get lost before the end. I'll put the link to buy the book if you haven't got it already in the chat in a moment. And I'll just introduce Hedley quickly. Hedley's a non-binary trans person based in the UK. They've got a PhD in contemporary British literature and queer theory, and they're currently writing a guide to non-medical transition for non-binary people. They would like to acknowledge, as is customary in their home country, that they come from a city which was built on traditional coast Salish territory. And with that, I'll hand over to Hedley and Jamie.
Thanks, Simon. And also, hi to Izzy, who's just said hi there to me. I'm really pleased that I seem to know quite a few of the people who are participating in this session today. So I guess I'll start by saying hello, everyone of all genders, and welcome to this event. As Simon said, I'm Hedley. I use they, them pronouns. I am very delighted to have amazing non-binary person, Jamie Windust, here with us today. Jamie also uses they, them pronouns. So I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction here. I will say that Jamie is a writer, editor, public speaker, and model. And in each of these roles, Jamie promotes queer and trans representation. As an undergraduate, they founded Fruitcake, which they describe as a queer print publication celebrating the creativity, excellence, and power that queer people hold. This endeavor won them the Future Talent in Communications Award at the prestigious Graduate Fashion Week Awards in 2018. They went on to achieve a first-class honors degree in fashion management and marketing from the University for the Creative Arts, Epsom. I think it's fair to say that their specialist subject is fashion, and particularly the ways in which fashion intersects with gender. And those are some of the topics that we'll be discussing today. Jamie approaches fashion from a number of perspectives. In addition to researching and writing about the fashion industry, they have professional experience as a model. They have worked for brands including ASOS, Dove, Gucci, LUSH, Tommy Hilfiger, and UGG. Today, we'll be discussing Jamie's new book called In Their Shoes, Navigating Non-Binary Life. In this memoir, Jamie tries to make sense of everything from school to family to work to mental health to relationships as a young non-binary person in a rigidly binary society. We're going to start with a reading from the book. A very warm welcome, Jamie, and over to you.
Thank you, Hedley. Hi, everyone. I'm going to read a short little snippet from the beginning for you all. So this is the first chapter called Someone Else's Shoes. I literally tried being in someone else's shoes once, and it wasn't the most comfortable experience. Probably because it meant that I had to wear flat shoes for more than 10 minutes, which is never a nice feeling. Too close to the ground, too real. Every step you take is too close to the earth that supports us. Too close to the very thing that holds us steady, but also the thing that has the ability to collapse beneath us at any given moment, allowing us to fall to the center, allowing us to empathize with similar feelings, that feeling of absorbing someone else's time, the shape that they have carved out for themselves, with you sliding on top, not necessarily fitting exactly, but being able to feel that time has passed there, that memories, birthdays, deaths, happiness, terror have all happened for this person in their shoes. But now you're wearing those shoes. You're in control of them, seeing the world from a fresh perspective, a perspective you might not know and a perspective you might not like, but you're seeing it, and that's what's important. I often think that we are in an empathy drought. In this current climate we are in, with the world and its news whirling past us constantly, Worldwide global crises feel like they're happening just in the palm of our hands, but are in fact real, tangible, life-threatening moments that are happening somewhere all over our planet. Once the next one comes through, beeping at us in the middle of the night or catching our eye on the news screens when we're waiting at the train station, we forget what we were just feeling. We are the prizes in the claw crane games at the arcade, swiftly being picked up from above and moved to another spot to witness a new piece of information that requires our full attention and our care. Swiftly forgetting where we just were and acclimatizing to our new surroundings. Trans people are often forgotten about for this very reason. I think realistically, people prioritize problems that are happening to them and subsequently prioritize other issues based on their proximity to them. People are often blinded by their own privilege and scope the paper every morning on the way to work or scroll through Twitter whilst having a cigarette and gravitate towards the issues that they think could impact them or someone in their immediate circle most quickly. Often when you are part of a marginalized community, this isn't a bad thing. As trans people, we are often constantly looking out for trans and non-binary people because we are nestled so tightly within our community, and our newsfeeds become flooded with transness all of the time, allowing us to feel integrated, aware, and part of our community struggles and burdens, but also our joy and success. Thank you very much. That is the beginning of the book. Here's the little version next to the big version. Yeah, Ta.
Thank you. That was an excerpt from Jamie's book, In Their Shoes, Navigating Non-Binary Life. And thank you for that very much, Jamie. Let's start with the book. What motivated you to write In Their Shoes? That's kind of my first question. And what kind of audience did you have in mind for this book when you were writing it?
Yeah, I mean, what I loved about the book was that I had a lot of fears about the literary industry in terms of how it works, how it's quite outdated, it's quite a long process. Often ideas are very much manipulated into very commercial entities. And what I liked about working with my publishers, Jessica Kingsley, and working on the book was that the whole process in creating what the book was going to be about was collaborative. So initially we had thought of creating a book for a lot younger audience. So like, I think we were looking at kind of like 8 to 13. And I was like, I don't think for my first book that would work for me. I need to be able to speak to a broad audience. You know, I've had a lot of feedback that it's not just for people in my generation. People of any age can read the book. But I think the motivation behind it was that I had gotten to a point in my career where I felt that I was only able to share very kind of small snippets and clips of what I actually wanted to say. A lot of what I was saying in the media was being rounded off or the corners were being cut. And I think I just wanted to essentially use this moment within their shoes to put a timestamp on my life and to be like, right, this is me in 2020. This is what my life is like, and it's going to change, but it's nice to have that kind of marker of time really for it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right that in corners of the media, we tend to see there's a lot of deliberate editing of how trans people are quoted and represented. And so the book gives you that opportunity to be completely unabridged and to say things in your own words, in your own way, without worrying that someone is going to take something out of context and misquote you.
Yeah,
that's great. Thank you. I just wanted to add that the book, for our listeners, the end of each chapter includes a kind of list of things I would say to a non-binary person. And I really like that sort of distilled kind of point by point, you know, if you're interested in doing this, if you're thinking of going into work or dating or whatever it is. Was that something that you wanted to include from the beginning?
Yeah, I think because the book had many iterations, as it were, there were lots of ways in which my publishers and me, when we were collaborating, saw this book coming out. Initially, the idea was that the book would just be formed in a very kind of instructional way, as like a very kind of readable guide, kind of like how you've just described with the last points at the end of each chapter, that instead would have made up the whole book. And I was like, when I thought about that idea, I thought, you know, this is a really key thing that I want to include, some very tangible moments. But equally, what was important for me at the beginning of writing was to be like, all I can do here is share my experience. And I can't offer, a lot of the time people want very tangible answers. They want very realistic, like, what should I do? And unfortunately, everybody's case is different, and I can only share what I have experienced to then prompt you to see things in a potentially new way. Not to say that my experience is right. And then I think that's what I liked about the book. So lots of my experiences in the book were, you know, by all means, brilliant. But for like, as a theorist, Hedley, you, not me, far from it. And that's what I always say is I'm not anti-theory in any way, but I always say, with me, there's an assumption that people will come to me and I will kind of regurgitate queer theory. And I'm like, well, you know, I obviously know bits and bobs of queer theory. It's important to know that. But if you want to learn from me, you can learn through my experience. If you want to learn from academia, unfortunately, you're not going to get that here, because I had to quite quickly in my career realize what I can do and what I can't do, and what I need to be able to do and what I can't do, and that's one of those things.
I think for the non-binary and trans community, it is quite important for us to share peer experiences and peer learning, because there is just nothing out there. You know, you can, like you said, you can go so far with theory, but really you can look at other people's experiences and kind of find your own way, looking at what has worked for other people or perhaps what has not worked for other people as well. So I think that's why we're perhaps drawn to write guidance and you know, things like that with that sort of sharing information at the heart of it. Before we move on to talk a bit more about identity, I wanted to ask you the obligatory pandemic question, which is, have you modified your style for the world of online events and video calls? Do you want to tell us about your look today?
My style has changed massively, and the pandemic has impacted that. But I think one thing that hasn't changed is I still like to make an effort for myself. You know, my mum always says to me, she's like, why have you got makeup on? And I'm like, well, like even in like the height of the pandemic, when we literally were not leaving the house at all, really, I was like, well, it's something to do, first of all. And it just kind of puts a bit of a spring in my step. I have definitely gone through a style evolution with the pandemic. And I think there's a real sentiment in that I've seen a lot of trans people and non-binary people talk about, is that we've not had to live in as much of a fight or flight state of mind. And a lot of my experience is that fight or flight comes from being visibly trans and how I look. So when we were all stuck inside, for me personally, I was like, well, it really just stripped everything back. I was like, I felt relaxed, I felt free. And then I was able to actually really assess why I was wearing these clothes. What was the purpose? not that there was no purpose, but like just to really think like, what do I actually want to do this? And yeah, that's why my look has changed quite a lot, and I'm very happy with it. And it's probably been the best thing that's come out of the pandemic, is my kind of reassertion with myself to be like, right, you're still exactly the same person as you were. Your identity is no different. The strength of it is no different. You're just expressing it differently. And I think that's really nice.
Anecdotally, I've heard that there have been a lot of people who have kind of come out during the pandemic. And I think that is partly having that time to do a lot of self-reflection during lockdown. And I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of people have experienced a kind of personal evolution in that sense. I never wore bright colors before, but now I feel really compelled to wear like yellow, which is a completely new thing for me. So yeah, that's thank you for that. That kind of segues into the next thing I wanted to talk about, which is identity. And there's a great quotation. You've said that there is no one way to be non-binary, which I completely agree with. You say that it is an identity that is yours to shape and create and evolve. So I was wondering if you could talk about what non-binary means to you personally.
I think for me, with that sentiment and that quote, what I wanted to try and portray in that message is two things. One is that I'm aware from my experience in my job that the media and the fashion industry specifically like to pedestal us people who are non-binary, that are assigned a male at birth, as the one way to look non-binary. White femme androgyny is kind of seen as the archetype, and that sentiment that you quoted there is to say there is no one way, because I think often people think that you have to then change how you look necessarily to be non-binary, which is not correct. And also I wanted to say that because a lot of the time we feel like our identity is shaped by external factors, so the media, family, all of these things. And I wanted to kind of hit home that yes, it's true, these factors of the world can affect our identity and affect how, if we come out, affect our visibility, but ultimately we are the only people that can shape it and define it. And I think I wanted to almost reclaim that power, to be like, you are the only person that can say who you are and what you are. Yeah.
And if you think about it, having two categories, sort of binary of female and male, is so incredibly limiting. And so non-binary, to cover everything else, kind of has to be very broad and individualized. And I think that's something that each trans and non-binary person does develop, that kind of sense of identity and gender expression. I was wondering if we could pick up on labels a little bit. I noticed that in the book you use the terms non-binary and trans interchangeably. Do you also identify as trans, and how important are identity labels to you?
Yeah, I think I've had quite a lot of commentary on that, both both positive and negative, really. I think for me, I do identify as trans. I feel as comfortable with being called trans as I do non-binary. There are different social, I guess, ramifications of being called trans. So, like, for example, at times when I've been in groups of new people and I've said, "Oh, I'm trans," so they obviously immediately think in a binary sense, and they almost kind of squint and they try and work it out. And labels for me are something that societally I don't think are important, but I do understand, equally on the other side of that, I do understand the importance of labels when they are recognized by the people putting them on.
Sorry, go on.
No, it's okay. I mean, again, I think it's just like, if I label myself, I think there's power in that. It's like when for example, like with plus size models, they would now they've almost reclaimed the label of, oh, I'm a fat model, I'm a fat activist. You know, if you reclaim something, if you reclaim an identity and you label it yourself, I don't know if I necessarily believe that the harm from that label disappears, but there definitely is strength in it. It becomes slightly less harsh, I think.
It's an interesting one, because non-binary is a sort of negative way to describe yourself, in the sense that you are not binary. And I sort of struggled with that for a while, because I thought, what am I then if I'm not binary? And there are all sorts of very specific gender identities that you can explore and research and so on. But what I found useful, I wanted to read this quotation. There's a very useful book called Trans Like Me by C.N. Lester, who's a non-binary and trans writer, and they define trans. They write in this book, trans is the word I favor, as it has the broadest and most flexible definition. Any person who in some way or combinations of ways has found that how they experience their gendered self does not fit with the gender and sex they were assigned at birth. So as you were saying, you may have been assigned male at birth and socialized as a boy, or assigned female at birth and socialized as a girl. If people are cisgender or cis, they continue to identify with that gender that they are assigned at birth. But if you feel that there's something that doesn't quite fit, that identity no longer explains you or defines you in some way, then you may want to identify as trans. And I found that a very useful definition, because it doesn't hinge transness on any particular experience, like dysphoria, for example. It's just sort of saying, if you have this sense that things are not quite how they were, you know, with this identity that was imposed on you at birth, then you might want to look into this. And I liked that approach. I think that's a kind of nice way to look at it. Is that something that resonates with you?
Yeah, massively. I completely agree. It almost simplifies it into I guess ironically quite a binary question. It's like, does something not fit? Does something feel a bit dodgy when you think about the gender you were assigned, the sex you were assigned at birth? And I think there is a question there that I don't understand why so many people get angry about, when it's like, I've seen in the past couple of years a growing almost distance from certain parts of the community where trans people are almost completely, and I've had a lot of it from people from my hometown actually who are trans, that are like, how dare you say that you're trans, all of these things. And it's like, well, yeah, if you boil it down to what you've just said, and also what I was saying about how it's a self-determinate label.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I think that's really important, that people define their own gender identity. That is not someone that anyone else can put that label on you. And it takes away the power from people who might want to do that in a harmful way, like transphobes. You know, if you say, no, this is how I identify, and no one else has any say in that, then that kind of gets away from those toxic discussions. I thought we could maybe look a little bit, or think a bit about, you talk a lot about taking your time, and this is something that certainly resonated with me, because that whole conversations you have, even if it's just in your own head around gender identity, that's a vast concept. How important is it to take your time with gender exploration?
I think that there's, again, that sentiment was written because I wanted people to understand that what you see from people, even like myself or people online, or is not the full story. Even me writing this book, it's just, I can't possibly include the full story of how I got here. And I think people kind of joke with me about my age, and like how, especially when the book came out, or when I announced that I was writing it, I was only I just turned 21, and people were like making incredible assumptions, like, how have you got your life together? How can you write a guide? And I was like, well, I'm not, and I don't. I don't have my life together. No one really does. I'm just sharing my experience, and I think that comes with people placing their expectations on you, and you know, you have to take your time, because like I said earlier, everyone's situation is different. You can't rush these things, because it's not as simple. So I get so frustrated with a lot of kind of especially at Pride, with kind of these very slap-handed slogans of like, just do you, come out. And it's like, okay, yeah, sure, if we all could, we would, wouldn't we?
Yeah.
We can't. Like, some of us can, and I was fortunate to be able to, but I also would not feel comfortable sharing that advice with people who may not have a supportive friendship group, or maybe in very rural parts of the country or the world, or you know that instinctively by coming out it can put them in danger. So I think that, I wanted to make that clear, because you have to think of very literal safety concerns first, rather than just plowing ahead.
And everyone starts from a different point and ends at a different point, and it is a very individual journey. So there's no one size fits all. And I think that's the sort of danger of those kinds of slogans, is that, there are a lot of assumptions there. Let's talk about the fashion industry. This is something I was really interested to read about. You've studied and written about fashion, you've worked as a model, and I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about what you model and what modeling has been like for you.
I found the industry incredibly, it's probably the only, the literary industry is slightly different. The fashion and the modeling world is probably one of the only industries I've worked in that is exactly how you think it is. So it is as stupid as it appears, or it is just as ostentatious and ludicrous, which is kind of why I enjoy it. I see it as quite an escape. I think when I started getting into it, I found it as just as fun. And then what happened was I started, writing. I started doing kind of public speaking, more journalism, more kind of public facing things where I was talking about gender and identity. And then what happened was my modeling, which used to be quite a fun outlet, suddenly turned into this very like serious message space as well, where people would want to kind of mix everything that I do and put it into one. And, that's fine. And that happened quite a lot, and it still happens now. And what I had to very quickly learn is that these people in fashion don't necessarily care about you. They just think you might look all right, and they're using your message for clout. And when I realized, when I kind of got around that and put my ego out to one side, I just became frustrated, because I was like, well, I love this industry. It's such a huge part of my life, and I want to be able to enjoy it. So now in all of my work, but especially fashion, I'm very selective with who I work with, because if you want to use a marginalized voice to front or be part of some form of fashion campaign that also has a message to it, you have to be doing it right. So I almost work quite a lot of the time now. I don't actually model. I just work in a consultancy perspective. So like roles would come forward, I'd be asked if I want to model, and I would kind of be like, no, thanks. But if you're still doing this campaign, I'd love to like get in behind the scenes, so that at least there's someone there that has that lived experience to be able to make it a little bit true to life. But in the past year, it's completely changed. Most of my modeling is now done through social media, which I used to have a real guard up about. I used to think, oh God, people are going to think I'm this, or people are going to think I'm that. And now I just I really don't care. In the nicest way possible. Like I just have fun with it. It's gone back to being my like fun thing.
Mm-hmm.
which I enjoy.
Yeah, that's important. I'm curious, when you were starting out and you were modeling clothes and stuff, would people approach you and say, I have designed non-binary clothes, would you like to model them? Or would they say, you know, this is from my binary collection, which side of the binary would you like to model? I mean, how did that work? I can't, you know, I don't know anything about the fashion industry, so.
Yeah, no, I think it's a lot of the time it would be so I wouldn't get cast in things that were specifically women's wear, for example, or men's wear. I would get cast in things that are either about a product that is for everyone, or it would be like an editorial. So it wouldn't be selling a product, it would just be fashion for like a magazine or for online, where it's just quite arty and quite conceptual. So they wouldn't need to, I could basically wear anything. But yeah, I do get a lot of offers to work with very like non-binary specific brands, or when high street brands do kind of genderless non-binary collections, but I have no desire to do that with most of them because they're all very boring. So
yeah, there's a kind of limited idea, I think, of what that might look like in this idea of androgyny, which I find frequently tends to look more to me like masculine style clothes than what I picture as androgyny, which, you know, by definition has elements of the andro part and the gyno part. You write in the book that despite some changes, high fashion femininity is still monopolized by white cisgender, so not trans women, whereas masculinity is something everyone is allowed to step into. And that I was sort of thinking about that as well. Is that something that from where you are now, maybe a year on, does that still seem to be the case, or has that changed a little bit during the pandemic?
I think, and this is what I really actually enjoy about the book, is that so much of my thought processes have evolved. You know, I wrote this in 2019, which to today's standards seems like 50 years ago. But yeah, no, I think there is definitely still an argument in my head for that. You know, when if you specifically in high fashion, but it does filter down into kind of our high street traditional fashions of, like you've just said, if there's a gender neutral or a non-gendered collection, they will still use cis women to front anything that is deemed as androgynous or potentially seen as slightly more feminine, rather than just using either non-binary people or a man, essentially. But I think with the concept of everyone can be masculine, you know, in the past 2 years, I've learned that although that might be true in the fashion industry specifically, with certain sections of people and demographics of people, like Black women or kind of bisexual women, they can't just be masculine and get away with it, but and live with the ease that I described. You know, I was like, masculinity is seen as this entity that everyone can just adopt and it's fine. And it's like, well, actually, no, that's not true. I'm not saying my book is full of lies, but it's just, I enjoy that part of the book of being able to be like, okay, this is what I thought at that point in time. And now I think differently, and that's fine.
So you will have to write a sequel so we can have an in-person event. I'm interested in non-visual expressions of gender, things like voice, in some cases touch and smell. And I was really struck by this comment you made about Matt, your non-binary ex. Their smell to this day still makes me scream internally if I smell it on someone else. And I wanted to ask you, what does non-binary smell like? Not this particular fragrance, but just, is there a way to kind of articulate that? Is this something that ever came up in your modeling career? Have you modeled for fragrance brands?
Interesting you say that. In a couple of weeks I'm doing a fragrance. I'm going to shoot a fragrance ad, and it's very interesting. I've not thought of it like this before, but it is for a brand that have a very distinct men's and women's perfume. Like their bottles are like the bodies of
yeah.
So, and I've been cast in the female spray, as it were. Which is interesting. I've not thought of it like that, as like a non-visual. I think that's a really interesting question. I don't know. I think much like fashion, much like beauty, much like fragrance, that I wouldn't say there's a non-binary smell, but I would just say with all of the things that I choose to wear and put on my face, it just comes from a desire to like it. I have lots of kind of traditionally masculine perfumes. I have lots of traditionally feminine perfumes. And that's infiltrated now more into my fashion. Like I would never really used to wear like traditionally men's clothing or shop in the men's section, but now I do. And I still feel as non-binary as I did when I was shopping and, wearing heels and dresses every day.
Yeah, it's another part of identity that I think you can shape and claim or reclaim in some way if it is coded or traditionally, we associate maybe floral scents with more feminine kind of stereotypes. There might be ways to, perhaps there are more, I don't know, gender neutral scents that you could explore. I keep thinking about citrus things. I really like citrus, and that seems to me more of a kind of new, I don't know. Just something that struck me, but something to maybe explore. And that's really interesting, that the timing as well, that you're doing this now. So that's, hopefully we'll be able to find out more about that later. I'm thinking we should possibly move on, but let's talk a little bit before we open the discussion to the audience, which we will do shortly. I thought we could talk a little bit about activism, because I think it's fair to say that it's very difficult to be trans and not be an activist. At a minimum, you're constantly advocating for yourself and educating people around you. And an example of this is, I think, and you do mention this, is writing yourself into almost every single form that you fill in. Because almost inevitably, anyone who identifies as non-binary, I think, will have run into this, where you get two options which say male and female, and you go, okay, what do I do? And if it's a hard copy form, you can actually write in pen a little message, which I always do, and then post it back. So that kind of having to carve out space for you, which takes an awful lot of energy to do constantly, and to feel that kind of constant erasure. So you talk about wanting non-binary recognition legally, socially, and institutionally. And I realize this is kind of a massively broad question, but I thought, could you talk a little bit about what this recognition would look like?
I think for me as well as what I just said about learning publicly since writing the book, the campaign specifically that I write about in the book is around, like you say, passport recognition, legal documentation, recognition. And at the time, it was like a lot of activism was born out of anger, was born out of a frustration that I was renewing my passport. It hadn't really crossed my mind before that this wouldn't be an option. And then after speaking to lots of people, I realized that it was a collective problem. But I think now, and to look at your question and think, what does legal recognition look like? Now I've realized that actually legal recognition isn't necessarily a benefit to all. And, take the census, for example. There was lots of discussions recently around whether or not trans and non-binary people should put their gender identity within this form, because for some, having the government have a record of your gender identity, it doesn't make them feel safe, doesn't make them feel included. It actually does the opposite. And when I started the campaign about 3 years ago, I was naive to that information. And I think through speaking to lots of people over the past few years, speaking to kind of refugee charities and like LGBT specific asylum seekers, I realized that actually, this isn't necessary for everyone. Because if you look at my biggest one in changing my thought processes around it was that although it might be a good idea for me, if you look at the ways in which in this country lesbian, gay or bisexual asylum seekers are asked to prove their sexuality, if you then added transness into that mix and the government were able, you were able to document that, you don't know what abuses that could lead to, abuses of power. So yeah, I mean, at the moment, it's something that I've stepped back from. There's someone else who's been campaigning on it for years. I'm going to let that person rock and roll. And yeah, just take a step back from activism because it's just not for me.
It's that particular one around the passports is a very complex issue. I realized recently I have dual citizenship, so I have 2 passports, and I just assumed that my UK passport, which includes all my biometric information, that was the same for everyone. And I found out that that's only the case if you were not born in the UK. So, the government has my biometric information, but not that of my colleagues who were born here. And that felt like quite a sobering moment. I think sort of realizing that there is a difference, there is a very quantifiable difference. I do wonder in the case of passports, if it might be worth at some point looking at just not having gender on there at all, because certainly, if you've got biometric information, that's going to be a lot more accurate in identifying someone than a little letter, which may or may not correspond to how you stereotypically expect someone to look. So yeah, there is a lot of nuance in that discussion, I think. There are people in the audience today, as we know, who are not trans themselves, but who would like to support trans people. And I wanted to ask you, what is one message that you would like them to take away from this event? What's something that you'd like to maybe share with them?
I think for me, the one message that I try and convey in everything that I have been doing for the past, it's quite a recent revelation, but in the past year or so, is that you have to have the intention of wanting to change to be able to take something away. You can listen to, not just me, but you can listen to us talk, you can listen to, you can go and look at all of the resources in the world. If you don't actually have the desire to change how you think, or if you don't actually have the empathy within you to be like, oh my goodness, this is actually really bad, I want to do something about this, then you're always going to find a reason not to. So what I take away is that, yes, trans people need help, trans people need your support and your allyship, but also try and get this image out of your head of gender being something that we struggle with. Because as I said at the beginning, it's something that outwardly causes us to feel stressed, but inwardly, if I and I have done it for the past year, if I was to not leave the house for a long time, I did notice how less and less stressed I was by being non-binary, because I don't feel stressed by it. It's not a struggle. Fortunately for me, it's not a struggle within me at this moment in time. So I'd say that don't try and kind of turn it into quite a savior complex situation.
It's that external kind of dysphoria, if you want to look at it that way, rather than internal. And I think a lot of non-binary people experience that. If you go into a shop and you have the men's section and the women's section, and I've never understood why that's applied to things like shoes, for example, which are surely you can just have them in different sizes and it doesn't matter. They don't need to be gendered. There are so many examples like that. So yes, thank you. That's a great answer. Let's throw it open to the audience. I can see that we've already got a couple of questions here in the Q&A box. So we'll take a few moments to look at these. So we've got one. This is from JH, who asks, do you have any tips for navigating uni as a non-binary person? I'm starting this year and I'm scared because I want to be assertive about my pronouns, but also not be annoyed all the time and looking for transphobia. What would you like to say to them, Jamie? That's something that I think you may have navigated yourself in your university career.
Yeah, I think for me, university was I was fairly fortunate because I mean, this could be classed as an assumption, but I went to a creative university. So there was not necessarily more queer and trans people, but there was definitely more people that were open about it than what I had experienced in education previous. So I think with this idea of assertion, it's still something I struggle with pronouns. You know, I still find myself in lots of situations where I don't say anything, even if I'm being misgendered. And what I would say is it's okay to say what your pronouns are, and it's something that I think should be encouraged. But you also have to acknowledge that what other people think about you and what other people's perception of you, you have to kind of try and process it as none of your business sometimes, because otherwise, like you say, you don't want to be annoyed all the time and looking for transphobia. And that's an incredibly hard thing to do. But equally, if you do, from my experience, when I did that all the time and I was looking out for things, when I was in that fight or flight all the time, my mental health just went completely through the floor because you're just in constant fight or flight. So I'd say try and find some people that are queer, join the queer society if there is one, find like a queer network, because most universities have one. And yeah, just try your best.
That really resonated with me as well, because I went through the same thing of coming out at work and trying to educate everyone, and then just really that had a huge detrimental effect on my mental health as well. What I have found is I think it's worth the people that you will see a lot constantly, those are the ones that you can kind of invest in and sort of teach about pronouns. The interactions where you see someone once and you're never going to see them again in a shop or something, I think in that case, you don't necessarily have to invest that energy. It depends on, you know, where you are on that day. How much energy do you have? Is it worth going through the whole thing with this person? Or do you just kind of shrug off the misgendering and just leave the shop? That's, yeah, you can make those decisions. So that's one thing. But I think that there is, if you are going to university, do talk to your lecturers in advance, because really at this point there should be much more understanding, and the lecturer should be able to set the tone with other students and be able to use the pronouns that you tell them that you use. So I think that's, yeah, something to be aware of. And of course, as we were discussing earlier, if you are using Zoom, you can put your pronouns in your profile name, which is very helpful. That's a really useful way to just indicate that without having to say anything at all. If you use Teams, unfortunately, it doesn't have that functionality yet, but it may be coming in the future. We had another question from JH as well. And it says, I think Jamie is the name you were given at birth. What are your feelings about using it now versus when you were younger, even though it's gender neutral? I know lots of non-binary people use the names they were giving, so I was just wondering how you felt.
Yeah, I mean, I've never, I think from listening to other people, changing names comes from dysphoria, or just a memory of an experience that name is tied to. And although, yes, I don't personally experience dysphoria, but I have obviously experienced time where I was socialized as a boy with my name. I don't personally feel I didn't feel like a desire to change it. And I'm comfortable with it. And I guess, again, like you say in the question, I'm slightly fortunate that my name is kind of ambiguous anyway. But I think it's a completely personal question and situation. And I think if you feel like there is something within you that doesn't fit with the name that you were given, or you just want to change your name for like a new start, it doesn't necessarily have to be about dysphoria. You could just be like, oh, okay, I'm going to change my name because I want to kind of start afresh. I've thought about that sometimes. By all means, rock and roll. I think it's a great thing to do.
Yeah, you can change your name legally by deed poll in this country for free, which I did last year. And I would say, I changed my name because my old name, my dead name, started to feel like it just didn't fit. People made assumptions about it because it was a very gendered name. But I will say, going back to our previous point, take your time. That is a huge life-changing decision if you are changing your name. So don't feel like you have to do it overnight. Look at your options, try them out, get people to call you different names, order a parcel to yourself in a name, try them out and give yourself time to really find something that makes you feel comfortable.
Yeah, no, definitely, because it's also got potential, legal ramifications. You have to change, like a lot of things will change. So yeah, that's good advice. Take your time with it.
If we got any other questions, is there anyone who would like to throw something into the Q&A? We've got a few more minutes that we could discuss. If not, I'm going to ask you something. And I wanted to ask you this. So when this event was originally scheduled for last month, at that time I had been watching Glow Up, and I noticed that you have a cameo in an episode, and I wanted to ask you, did you know that you were in that episode? It's the London Fashion Week episode.
Yeah, so there's two. So there's I didn't actually know I was in that one. I just happened to be sauntering around in a stupid outfit. But then, not to do a spoiler, but I am also in the second series, in the final, I got bumped up a bit. I've been invited as a guest, so we're in. But yeah, no, I love that. I absolutely love that program.
Has the second series aired yet, or is that still kind of in production? Or
yeah, so second series aired last year. It's on Netflix now, and then the third series is airing this month.
Okay, I don't know how I missed that. I caught the first one on Netflix, and then there didn't seem to be anything else. So yeah, I'm a little behind. I'm still in the middle of this season of Drag Race UK. So no spoilers, please.
Nothing here.
Is that not, you're not a fan of that? Is that something you tend to avoid?
I am a fan. I just didn't want to say anything that could.
Okay. Yeah. I won't. Thank you. I appreciate that. It probably takes all the fun out of it if you know who's won. But yeah, no, that's great. I think Glow Up is a really interesting concept, because it's something that as you said, if you're interested in those kind of skills, it really doesn't matter who you are. You can kind of develop them. And they had quite a range in the series that I watched, quite a range of contestants. So it was kind of, just interesting to follow that. It looks like we've got a couple of other questions here. So we have one from David, who says, do you feel there is still a lack of representation of non-binary people assigned / raised male?
I'd say no. I think quite the opposite. I think there is an assumption that is the way to be non-binary, and I think what we need to see more of, and what I enjoy doing at Gay Times and working at Gay Times with, is being able to show the breadth and depth of non-binary representation and visibility, because there is that, you can, not to rehash the point, but there is no one way. So And I think often the presumed way to see a non-binary person is someone like myself, or someone who has been assigned male at birth. So yeah, I think overall, yes, of course, there's a lack of representation for non-binary people. But if you were to shrink it down and look at what the representation actually is, I think there needs to be more diversity there.
That's interesting. Yeah, I've heard the opposite, that it's mostly assigned female at birth people who tend to be represented, but I think it depends where you're looking or what context, or yeah, so yeah, thank you. And then we have just one more from JH, and we'll make this the final question here. They say, thanks for answering my questions. If there was to be an exclusively trans / non-binary reboot of a show, what would you pick?
Great question. I'm a huge fan, this won't come as a surprise, to Glee. I absolutely love Glee. And there are some trans people in Glee, but I would obviously love to see the whole cast trans, or maybe just like something rogue. Like, what if they just decided to do EastEnders, like completely trans? Sure, I'll be there.
That would be, yeah, that would be great. They could kick it off on Trans Day of Visibility and just do yeah. That's a great question. Yes, and David says, fantastic question.
Great question.
Yeah. All right, that's great. Okay, so we have time now for another very quick reading from Jamie. So I will pass that over to you. Thank you for the questions, and yeah, we'll hear from Jamie now with this segment from the book.
Thank you. This is from the mental health chapter, which is called The Stapler and the Jelly. One of the biggest things that impacts my mental health is the way in which I am treated in public spaces. I think that's why it was so difficult to deal with my poor mental state, because changing the way in which we are treated as non-binary people in public is not always within our control. We sadly can't curate the landscape that we are surrounded by all of the time, and therefore face the wrath of the oncoming world at such a pace that we aren't even able to truly acknowledge the strength at which the prejudice is coming. It's like being on the beach surrounded by a million grains of sand, and even though you have worn the right thing and you feel like you're prepared or that you're okay, the sand will still find a way to go down the back of your neck and hit you in the spots you didn't realize it could get to. People often say to me, yeah, but the people looking at you could just be looking in adoration or appreciation. You don't always know why people are staring at you. And my response is always the same. No one should feel like the second that they step outside of their house, they're here for anyone else's enjoyment, entertainment, or pleasure. Unless that's your aim of the day, or the pleasure doesn't bother you, then personally for me, I don't really care what the motivation is. This notion that we should be able to accept people looking at us doesn't sit right. When you're stared at, gawked at, or spoken about at every living moment that you're outside in public presence, no matter what the intent, it gets to a point where you can't just accept that this is the way that we're supposed to be living. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you. Hedley, you've been wonderful tonight. You've been a dream. Very good questions.
Well, I was going to thank you. Well, thank you very much for being a fantastic interviewee. This is a great event. I want to thank as well our lovely audience. Thank you to everyone, our international audience. In fact, we have people from all over the world with us. And I also want to thank Five Leaves Bookshop for making this event possible. They've had some really fabulous events with trans and non-binary writers, including C.N. Lester and Jack Halberstam and Jamie Windust tonight. So thank you, everyone, for joining us, and to Five Leaves. And I'll give the last thank you to Jamie. You've been brilliant. It has been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you as well. And thank you for to everyone for the rescheduling. I do apologize for that. But yeah, thank you, everyone. Lots of love. And I'll see you on the flip side.